come to order. And I'll turn it over to the Executive Director.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning. And I hope everybody enjoyed the function yesterday evening and we're able to hold some additional constructive discussions around mortality limits and the rest of the remaining agenda. This morning, the Conference Board and PAB are meeting and we'll continue with their agenda and hopefully wrap up by this evening, this afternoon, at which point they will actually go through a process of report adoption tomorrow morning and then present that back to the Commission tomorrow afternoon. The agenda for the Commission meeting this morning is as shown on the screen. We have the report of the 96th session of the Finance and Administration Committee to be presented. We will then jump into agenda item 14, which is the second performance review report and associated actions arising from that in terms of the recommendations and potential implementation. And then following that, we have both a public comment, short public comment period, as well as we will revisit some of the regulatory proposals that were provided to you initially yesterday. In addition, there was also a request for the Secretariat to develop some additional options on the Fishery Independent Setline survey design from Canada and the US, and we have a number of slides to present to you just before lunch with some of those alternative options that have been requested. So we'll also have that, and that's not currently on the written agenda, but we'll squeeze that in before lunch if that's okay, Chair. Okay, well, thank you very much. We'll move into agenda item 13, the report of the Finance and Administration Committee. I'd firstly like to point out that this is actually the first written report arising from the Finance and Administration Committee. Previously, it was simply rolled into discussions at the annual meeting and the recommendations developed as commission meetings through the annual meeting report. This was a request from the second performance review to comply with the rules of procedure of the Commission, which includes a requirement for a production of a report of the FAC. And so in that sense, we're moving into compliance in that regard. My intention this morning is to go through the recommendations that arose from that meeting, and there were 7 of them. And I will try and scroll to those. And then we can hold a discussion around how the Commission would like to handle each of them. The first recommendation, recommendation 01, was to do with the financial statement for 2019, and the Finance and Administration Committee has recommended that the Commission note the financial statements for FY 2019, which are provided in the FAC paper 04 Rev 3. And that the IPHC Secretariat would facilitate a deeper review of the corrections and write-offs as part of the financial statements for 2019. And we'll provide that as a report to the Commission intersessionally. I think that's a sound reflection of what the Commissioners are also feeling in terms of the financial statements for 2019. But I think given that we're stepping through these and there's a lot of ground to cover and summarize into the 7 recommendations, I'll pause at the end of each one to see if there's additional comment or feedback that the Commission would like to make in redirecting Secretariat's activities. So through the Chair, I'll pause for a comment from the Commission on recommendation 01.
We don't need a formal motion for this, Dr. Wilson, correct? I believe certainly from the U.S. side, we're in concurrence with that.
That's correct. It's simply, if you agree with that, that the Commission in effect notes the financial statements and that you are noting that the Secretariat is going to facilitate a deeper review, then you're simply noting that and you can move on unless there's any amendments. Okay. Thank you, Chair. In terms of the annual independent auditors reports for 2018-19, the Finance and Administration Committee has again recommended that the Commission note the status of the 2 audits and that the audits will be communicated to the Commission for intersessional endorsement. So we had the discussion about where the audits are at the moment, and the audits are dependent on the deeper review of the corrections and write-offs as part of the FY 2019 financial statements. So at this point, we're simply asking the Commission to note the status and that once they are completed, they will be provided to the Commission for intersessional endorsement. Thank you, Chair.
I don't believe I see any objection to that, so please proceed.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of the update to the FY 2020 budget, the Finance and Administration Committee has recommended that Commission note the following three elements. First of all, that the FY 2020 General Fund was approved last year with the expectation that it would run at a loss of $759,838 to draw down the carryover, the previously perceived carryover of the Commission. However, given that the previously targeted level of carryover funds has been reached 1 year ahead of schedule due to fish sales of approximately $1.2 million being received less than what was budgeted, the IPHC Secretariat would seek to reduce operating expenses to match income. And so in short, that means that we're going to be reducing our operating for 2020 by approximately $760,000 between both the general fund and also the supplemental fund. Also to note that the IPHC Secretariat will ensure that all FIS activities are accurately cost recovered from the supplemental fund to the general fund, and that auxiliary activities requested by the external parties, and this is the conversation around the additional satellite survey stations that we want to run, for example, from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and also DFO are fully cost recovered. And so at the moment, just to refresh your memories, we have letters of agreement or memorandum of understanding, depending, with each of those government agencies, outlining the activities that are being requested. And then as part of that, we have a budget for reimbursement once those activities are completed. And so this is just a note that we will go through those as new proposals are put forward and ensure that they are fully cost recovered. And so, Chair, with that, we'll see if there is Commission approval to note those three elements. Thank you, Chair.
So noted. Mr. Ryall.
Thanks. David, on paragraph A, at the end it says the IPHC Secretary to reduce operating expenses to match income. So does that mean that the loss of U.S. $759,838 would be drawn down, balanced out to zero, or is it something different?
I think given that we have, through the Chair, given that we have already commenced FY 2020, we may not be able to realize a full zero balancing in this account. However, the intention is to, first of all, ensure that we're fully cost recovering the FIS, which should bring down that drawdown on the general fund quite substantially. And then where possible, we're going to try and make additional cuts to the budget to reduce that, let's say, deficit between the income and expenses. And the agreement from the FAC on Monday was that we would come up with a list of areas where we're going to try and seek those reductions and provide those to you. We haven't formalized that, and it's going to take a little bit of time for us to step through the FY 2020 budget and see where we can make those cuts. And that's why it's not formalized in this recommendation. So just to clarify, we're going to come back to you in the coming weeks with a list of items that we're proposing or going to reduce our operating expenses on for 2020, and then also noting that we'll go for full cost recovery of the FIS for 2020 as well. Thanks, Chair.
Yes, thanks very much for that clarification, David. And so, and I think we had spoken, so we'll have that discussion intersessionally, and that'll give you enough time to put together that spreadsheet and come back to us with what you are thinking you're able to do to draw this down to be cost neutral. So with that, I'm going.
Thank you.
With that clarification, so noted.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of the FY 2021 and 2022 budgets, the Finance and Administration Committee has recommended that the Commission adopt the contracting party contributions for FY 2021 as follows. It lists both the Canadian contribution and also the US contribution in its totality. And then it also breaks it down in terms of the contribution to the general fund for operating, and then also the current schedule for the pension fund deficits for both parties. In addition, the US contribution, the total number, includes the $470,000, 717, which is to cover the estimated headquarters building lease, which is $370,000 projected, and maintenance costs of almost $100,000. And I'll just highlight that the lease hasn't yet been signed, which would take effect in October of this year. So that's the tentative amount that would be contributed. And so that's the two of those. Thank you, Chair.
Just I had a question. Typically, a building lease includes maintenance. Is maintenance a separate expense somehow?
Correct. Through the chair, correct. The lease is provided with certain CAM charges and estimates of what the expenses or maintenance would be. It is an estimate based on the needs of the building throughout the year. And so I think in 2019, we had a budget estimate that was lower than the realized expenses, maintenance expenses, due to some air conditioning issues in the building.
Thank you. And so would we be looking for a motion to adopt?
We would, Chair. I'll just provide two more points of clarification that I know were expressed at the FAC and between the FAC and now. First of all is the last sentence for the Canadian contributions, which notes that the pension fund will be revalued in April of 2020, and this may result in a variation of deficit payment required by Canada, but also by the US. In the table itself, it is also highlighting the indication that Canada provided additional contributions in 2017 or 14, I can't remember off the top of my head, 17, and Canada is therefore in advanced schedule payment for the pension fund. We're currently in communication with Mercer, who are the fund managers, to get a full breakdown of where both contracting parties are with the deficit payments. And then following the April Pension Society meeting, we'll provide the revaluation of the pension fund and the liabilities associated with that. The other comment that needs to be made as well is a reminder that the Commission is adopting a budget at this point for 2020. The caveat to that is that that budget is then subject to domestic contracting party, but internal budget approval processes. For example, Canada does not yet know that the increase has been approved, and therefore it would potentially fall back to last year's contribution level. Similarly, for the United States, the contributions are not determined by Congress until either late in the year or early in 2021. And so the caveat there is that the Commission would be adopting a budget contingent on those budget approvals from the contracting parties. And I would just want to suggest a slight change in our process moving forward, and this is something, again, we will discuss intersessionally, noting that those two contribution levels may vary from what the budget has been proposed and adopted as. Once we have those contributions set from contracting parties, the Commission should probably meet, and if they are under the budget approval, we would need to have a discussion around where we would cut various items from the budget so that we don't run at a deficit. Thank you, Chair.
Go ahead, Mr. Degree.
Just a point of clarification, Dr. Wilson, you said 2020 budget. This is the 2021 budget, is it?
Correct.
A couple of questions. So I guess at last year's meeting, you were talking about looking into feasibility of moving the headquarters, and obviously I think you resolved that. So it's cheaper to just continue to lease at this facility, or what's the status of that?
Thank you. Through the chair, we have been looking into specifically that option. However, time ran out on us, and as a result, we have put forward with our landlords a proposal for a 5-year budget. A 5-year lease. And we were not expecting this level of increase. This is a 50% increase of what's being proposed, from $22 per square foot to $32 per square foot. And this is something that the US is going to want to have discussions with us once we do have that lease proposal from the landlords about a future of the commission and the in terms of its location, the economics surrounding a move.
Another question. So I'm assuming in this budget, the FIS is going to be, neutral. So if we make decisions on changing any of our protocols for how we do the FIS, it's not going to really reflect in the budget because it's just assumed to be neutral in any scenario we use.
Through the chair, partially correct. The FY 2021 budget that is put before you is based on a standard grid in terms of number. And with that, I think we had a $47,000 surplus prediction. However, noting that we lost $1.2 million in the survey last year, it's very hard to predict at that sort of level. And so at the moment, that's sort of a placeholder budget for the FIS. And depending on the decisions that the Commission makes today and tomorrow on the design of the FIS, we would then go back and try and make it revenue neutral by adding skates or removing skates accordingly in certain locations. So the goal at the moment is revenue neutrality. However, given the other discussions that we're also having around the drawdown on the carryover and our reserve funds, our reserve cash, we would then have a discussion around potentially trying to make it revenue positive for this coming year. Thank you, Chair.
So David, in the next 5 years that we're under this new contract, will you be looking at different areas to potentially move unless the economy falls down and rents come down?
Through the chair, that's a discussion we would have with the US and in particular state in terms of whether they are willing to continue paying the headquarters lease at the rate in the new lease. If they are content with that, then we would most likely stay where we are.
So that's quite an increase of 50%. That's amazing. But I guess my question is, you'll be locked in for 5 years at that rate, but do you have an option for a shorter lease, like a 3-year lease, in order to contemplate on a sooner basis moving to somewhere else?
There are always options. Some of those options will involve paying out a certain amount and penalties. The landlords had proposed a 10-year lease, and we were uncomfortable with that given the suggestions for the increase. And as such, we've been able to negotiate it down to a 5-year lease. If we were to look to break the lease earlier, as I said, there would potentially be some penalties, and then that would be a discussion with state in terms of the financial viability of a move or not.
I guess so. Sort of 5 is as short as the landlord will go.
Correct.
Gotcha. Oh, sorry, Peter.
Just in terms of discussion on the proposed budget. Fish sales, I noticed as they are a placeholder, but you increased them. How confident do you feel that with stock assessment, everything that we're looking at, possible market competition, how confident do you feel that the FIS program will actually generate $5 million as opposed to 4.7?
Thank you. Through the chair, I think if I could predict that, I think I'd be in the fishing industry myself. It really is a highly variable environment. The prices previous year were in 2018 $6.19 per pound coastwide. We budgeted $5.75 and it came in at $5.45 as an average coastwide. And it's that level of variation which is very time dependent during the season. Prices vary in season. However, we do try and put our survey within a short time period within the overall fishing season. And as such, we are very much subject to fluctuations in price throughout the season. You made the comment that we increased the income. I'm not sure that's actually the case. And I'll just pop up to the 2021 budget. And if you could just highlight, I think, what you're referring to.
Sorry, just on the supplemental fund, the actual FIS sales income from the FIS program at $5 million. I believe last year it generated $4.7 million. And I'm just curious if that's a reasonable expectation, just in terms of what we're seeing in stock assessments and predictions. I just want to understand your comfort level and maybe some even rationale into why the difference.
Thank you. Through the chair. So this number was arrived upon by looking at recent fish sales by area where we fish, the tentative survey design that was being proposed and put forward to the Commission. It is going to be modified depending on the design that the Commission decides. And so at the moment, there's very much an in brackets $5 million expected revenue. It could be, as we saw last year, $1.2 million lower than what we expected. It could be higher. And that's going to take some work by the Secretariat following this meeting to look at the design that's adopted and make a determination about how many skates we put in the water at certain locations based on known fish abundance in those areas, prices in those areas, and then there's still going to be a very big caveat to that fish move, and we may or may not count them on the survey. And this partially comes back to the discussion around having a reserve of some description to ensure that when we do miss the mark on fish catches and therefore sales, we are protected from a budget perspective. So to summarize, the $5 million is an approximation, and we could be, as seen this year, off by 20% plus or minus.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to note that last year also was an extended survey as well, so a lot of stations. But I understand it's also a placeholder, so I just wanted to note that.
A couple of questions. Going back to the lease, when does that need to be signed, Dave? I guess maybe we're getting a bit late on that.
Through the chair, we've had quite a few difficulties with our landlords. They recently changed their lawyers, which caused us a great deal of difficulty in trying to finalize the draft lease. At the moment, we don't have a specific deadline. We've already signed off on a letter of intent to renew with them, which is lulled them, I guess, into a sense of security, and they're no longer rushing to provide the lease to us. But we do have a agent who's representing us and negotiating with the landlords to try and finalize that lease. And as of yesterday, it's being progressed, but it's entirely at the moment in the hands of the landlord and their lawyers in terms of drawing it up. So at the moment, we do not have that final lease in hand. Oh, Keith's giving me a signal, a thumbs up, which means that we now have that draft. And so given that that's the case, we will try and sit with Stacey together and circulate that amongst all commissioners. And if we're in agreement, sign off on that in a relatively short period of time.
So I guess a question for you, Chris, is who would be signing that? Is that yourself or a State Department that would sign the lease?
There's been a lot of back and forth on that, and I think it's been the State Department's position, Stacey can keep me in the back, and that the executive director is the appropriate party to sign that lease. And I know, just speaking in my own experience, 20-something years with the North Pacific Fishery Management Council, I, as director, signed the lease for our building lease during that time. So I think there are some concerns with the U.S. government signing that lease, and I think we just need to have some further internal discussions about that.
Okay, I guess just then on that, Canada is not in favor of having the executive director sign the lease. We see that as bringing Canada into any liabilities or obligations under a lease. That is a responsibility for the U.S. to be accountable.
David, how has it been done in the past? Did the ED sign, or did the, and Paul, who would sign?
Well, I guess from our legal perspective is that where the headquarters resides is whatever country it resides in is that party that's responsible for the headquarters. And it's not a joint responsibility in that specific treaty.
I was going to suggest that the new chairman in 3 days hence would be the appropriate party to sign the lease.
Well, that would be the wrong nationality. Like, I guess, I mean, seriously though, Chris, I don't see that Canada wants to be involved in the signing of a lease in the U.S. And similarly, I think where in Canada, where the Pacific Salmon Commission has resided, the executive director does not sign the lease. It's up to Canada to be responsible for the lease. We have a real estate branch that looks after leases, and that means the party is responsible for whatever happens to that lease. And if something went sideways on the lease, and then it's the party that's responsible, not the parties.
I guess I'm still not quite sure I understand your difficulty with the executive director signing the lease. I'm sorry if I missed that.
Yeah. Well, the executive director works for the parties, meaning then we would be responsible in some portion thereof. And I guess I don't understand why the state would not sign it. They're paying the bill.
Well, I would agree with you. If the U.S. government were to be the signer, it would more appropriately be the State Department than NOAA. But maybe that's just something we need to work out further. I don't think we're going to answer it right here today or this morning in this room.
Fair enough, but just wanted to let you know what we've been thinking about. Maybe just go back to the budget. Okay, so the question that Peter was raising around whether 5 million is the right number or not, I guess we're going to hear some options on survey design, and so will that potentially change that number? And as far as what's available, recognizing that the overall goal is to have cost neutrality around the survey. Do you think then, David, once we decide upon the design, that number may change, and that's something that we may discuss in the intersessional session, or it'll be at this meeting, but more likely at the session?
Through the chair, that number would change, and I would suspect that we need a little bit of time to do those numbers, and so it would be an intersessional discussion around the income and expenses with the survey in particular. I would suggest that wouldn't have an impact on the discussion around adopting the budget though, because it's just something that we normally do after we leave the commission meeting. We would look at the survey design and adjust skates up and down in certain locations to move towards that long-term revenue neutrality objective. Noting that we have drawn down the carryover to a low level. That discussion intersessionally would then also include a discussion about whether we needed to try and put more hooks in the water to build up a cash flow and reserve for the Fishery Independent Set Line Survey, the supplementary fund. But as a general principle for adopting the budget here, it wouldn't impact that number at the moment because it's not that it's a very flexible number in terms of income. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thanks very much. Further questions or comments on the 2021 budget?
So, Chair, just to confirm, what we're proposing is that the Commission adopts the contracting party contributions for Canada and the US as shown on the screen. In addition, we'll provide 2 additional paragraphs, one surrounding the contracting party determination process for contributions, and then that will could potentially impact the budget. And then the secondary component there is that if that were to occur, there would be an intersessional meeting to modify the Commission's budget in year based on those actual contributions. Thanks, Chair.
I would entertain a motion to approve, to adopt.
Make the motion to adopt.
This motion is made and seconded. Is there any further discussion or if not, is there any objection to the motion? Seeing none, it is so adopted.
Thank you, Chair. Then we can move on to recommendation 05, which was part of that, and I apologise for not highlighting that at the same time, which is essentially what you've just done, adopt the budget for the fiscal year, noting that we're making efforts to balance it. I would note that the FY 2022 budget is simply for information. It is outlined in the FAC report, and there's no specific recommendations to the Commission, noting that at the moment we're still going through the rationalisation and discussions around the carryover. So recommendation 6 is surrounding the financial regulation revisions, and the FAC is recommending that the Commission endorse and adopt the IPHC financial regulations, which will become a 2020 version. Those are currently provided in paper 08. And the caveat to that is that they would be adopted following additional review by technical experts from each contracting party. Now, as an update, we've received some comments from both from the US and Canada. We are waiting to incorporate those into a consolidated version for additional review. And so at this point, Chair, I would simply recommend that the Commission is endorsing the adoption of the financial regs pending those additional comments. We will try to have those to you by this afternoon. However, if those edits are of a substantive nature, the proposal would be, again, to move that to intersessional decision. And that may well be the more prudent and thorough way of adopting revisions to these financial regulations. If there are substantive edits being provided by the 2 contracting parties. And so that's just going to take a bit of time this afternoon. So I would suggest we roll over this recommendation to either tomorrow morning or Friday when we can provide you an updated on a consolidated version. Thank you, Chair.
That sounds like a good plan to me. Other commissioners have any objection to that?
Thank you. And then the final recommendation surrounding the procedure revisions. And again, the FAC is recommending that the Commission endorse and adopt the modified rules of procedure, so that will become a 2020 version, pending final comments expected from the conference board tomorrow when they present their additional amendments to their terms of reference and rules of procedure, and following additional review by technical experts from each contracting party. So we're in the similar situation. We're I would suggest that we roll this over to a discussion following the conference board presentation tomorrow afternoon for a potential adoption either Friday morning or again, if there are substantive changes, that we roll that over to an intersessional decision process. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Davis.
Just one quick question of clarification. So for the processor advisory board, we're not expecting any additional comments. They've completed their process.
Correct. Through the chair, the processor advisory board went through that review process last year, and those amendments were presented to the commission at the AM095 and adopted and incorporated into the 2019 version. So, and they've given no indication this year, or it's not on their agenda for this meeting, that there's going to suggest additional amendments at this time. Thank you.
Are we in a similar position with the other bodies, MSAB, RAB, etc.?
Through the chair, so the MSAB again last year went through a full revision of their rules of procedure, and similarly with the SRB and RAB. Thank you, Chair.
So seeing no further discussion, we'll proceed as suggested on that.
Thank you, Chair. That rounds out the presentation of the Finance and Administration Committee, and I would leave it open if there are any additional comments that you would like recorded in the Commission report regarding the proceedings of the FAC. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Ellis.
So I don't know if the U.S. commissioners need to talk about this, but if we're going to be locked into a 5-year contract at these costs and prices, and I know Seattle is just crazy on rents right now, I think we should have our ED looking geographically within elsewhere to see what other rents or what other options we might have, say 2 years out, so we can start to see what our options are.
Okay, what's next, Dr. Wilson?
So we would now move on to the next agenda item, which is an update on the second performance review. So I'll just close out some of these. Someone's fighting with me in the house. So this is specifically looking at the 2019 performance review of the IPHC O2 report document. There is also a PowerPoint presentation, which I'll step through first. If the back of the room could bring up the PowerPoint for me. So the purpose of this agenda item is to provide the Commission with an opportunity to consider once again the outcomes of the second performance review of the IPHC and to direct the Secretariat accordingly. Just as a little bit of background to refresh your memories, if you need it, the Commission adopted terms of reference and criteria and associated budget for the second performance review to the AM94 in 2018, and subsequent to that, following some of the budget discussions, it was agreed to defer the implementation of the performance review until 2019. This did occur in 2019 and has now been wrapped up, and this is why we're discussing the report at this time. Just to refresh your memory, the panel for the second performance review consisted of a number of independent individuals, and then also the representatives from both Canada, Mr. Robert Day, and the U.S.A, Stacey McCorkle. The independent chair, Terj Lebuck, is a legal expert who is highly experienced in international legal instruments and has participated in numerous performance reviews of regional fisheries management organizations. We were also complemented by two representatives from regional fisheries management organizations, Mr. Peter Floeling from the North Pacific Fisheries Commission based in Tokyo, and also Mr. John Sok Park from the North Pacific Anadromous Fish Commission based in Vancouver, Canada. We did struggle to have NGO participation in the panel. However, in the end, we were very fortunate that we were able to recruit Miss Amanda Nixon from the Pew Charitable Trust to join. The performance review was carried out throughout 2019 via 3 face-to-face meetings, one in Seattle, one in New York, and one in Ottawa. And in addition to that, the panel held several additional teleconferences, both among themselves to discuss the various performance criteria, and also with stakeholders. And as I mentioned, the meeting was also supported by independent legal expert, Tertial Buck, who also functioned as the chair, and a science expert in particular, Mr. Kevin Stokes, Dr. Kevin Stokes, who also undertook a peer review stock assessment that you heard about on day one. The process utilized documentation and presentations provided by the IPHC Secretariat, as well as feedback from yourselves, contracting parties, and also interviews with commissioners, subsidiary bodies, chairs and vice chairs, and also general stakeholders. There were a number of questions that were specifically asked or themes that were addressed in those interviews, which are shown on the screen. I won't go through them, but just to give you an idea of how the panel sought information on the performance of IPHC. The report was published via Circular 2019-21 on the 15th of October of last year, and we've just provided the links there again for general reference. One of the general comments or findings, I guess, and it's worth highlighting, is that the performance review congratulated the Commission, and obviously with the support from the Secretariat, the positive strides in response to the first performance review. And that was one of the key criteria where the panel went through the first performance review of the IPHC and specifically looked at progress since then. The panel highlighted that there was consistent and significant improvements in transparency, availability, and modernization of documentation and background information, and indicated that it had heard resounding praise for this increased transparency. And I think that's worthwhile highlighting. The panel produced a total of 26 recommendations, 7 of which I think are worth highlighting briefly here before we step into the process moving forward. And so I'll just quickly highlight those 7, what we've identified as key recommendations. First of all, in terms of the legal analysis, the performance review has recommended that the convention be updated, while in the interim period seeking alternate mechanisms to implement international best practices and legal principles. And that second part of the recommendation is recognizing that the idea of opening up a renegotiation of the convention is not highly palatable to the contracting parties at this stage, but there were other ways to seek improvements, such as amendments to the rules of procedure. In terms of the status of living marine resources, the panel recommended that opportunities to engage with Western Pacific halibut science and management agencies be sought to strengthen science links and data exchange. And so specifically talking about our recent engagements with Russian scientists, Korean and Japanese scientists working on Pacific halibut. And we're already making some great strides there through Dr. Joseph Plance's work. In terms of data collection and sharing, the panel recommended that observer coverage be adjusted to be commensurate with the level of fishing intensity in each IPHC regulatory area. In terms of consistency between scientific advice and fishery regulations adopted, to try and summarize in one paragraph, the panel recommended that the development of management strategy evaluation be used to underpin multi-year decision-making processes. And we've heard quite a lot of it from Dr. Hicks and also the MSAB co-chairs over the last couple of years, in particular this year, the progress that the Commission is making in that regard. The panel wanted to ram it home a little bit more and again recommended that the ongoing work on MSE be prioritised and strongly urged that the Commission conclude its MSE process and recommend that it meets its deadline of 2021. In terms of the relationship to non-contracting parties, the panel recommended that a full range of Pacific halibut stock is identified to extend as one stock to those Western areas, particularly Russia and Korea, that we continue to collaborate with scientists from those countries. So to cast your mind back to the interim meeting in November of last year, the Commission had recommended that the Secretariat develop a table of all 26 recommendations that arose from the second performance review and to include draft, proposed, responsibilities, timelines, priorities, as well as any initial comments of relevance to the recommendations arising. And the intention, therefore, is for the Commission at this meeting to review that table, which is provided as Appendix 1 to Paper 14, and determine if that is sufficient to move forward or whether you would like any particular amendments. And so I will jump to the report itself, and assuming you have it all on your screens before you, because it's going to be quite small, that's the report. If I could just have that paper brought up, please. So it's the Commission Paper 14. Cheers, thank you. And so provided in Appendix 1, it's going to be a little bit of a challenge to read it on the screen, so I do hope you have it in front of you. I'm going to run on the assumption that you have looked at the text in red, which covers off on those 3 requests from the Commission at the interim meeting, where we have the recommendation number, the recommendation itself, and then we've added a tentative priority, responsibility, and timeline for delivering that recommendation. And then where appropriate, we've provided a current update on status, whether it's pending, meaning no action has been taken at this time, or whether some action of relevance has already been taken, and we've provided text in terms of what progress has been made. And so through the chair, I would pass back to the Commission to obtain feedback on this text in red and how it looks either individually or as a group. Thank you, Chair.
Go ahead, Mr. Davis.
So I was looking first at, let me just pull it back up here, recommendation 10. And I'm not sure I understand the last part of their recommendation about regularized multi-year stock assessments. And I wondered if the Secretary had discussed or has an understanding of what's suggested there and how it relates to our current practice where we are generating a stock assessment in each year.
Through the chair, it's generally realized that you don't need to undertake a full stock assessment every year, and that the current agreed process for IPHC aligns with that, where Dr. Stewart undertakes every year updates to the stock assessment based on any refined information that's available. And then every 3 to 5 years, historically, and the SRB has recommended a 3-year schedule, we undertake a full revision to the stock assessment, a full update to the stock assessment. Now, the panel has had substantial experience in management strategy evaluation processes globally, and their experience it was clearly indicated that the intention of moving down the passage of undertaking MSE and then a management procedure is that you would try and limit the annual decision-making process into a more strategic process of a multi-year decision-making process. So that's where the panel is coming from, is that it's recommending that as the MSE is developed, it should be considered, and they're recommending rather than just considered, to influence the decision-making process from a multi-year perspective rather than an annual process. It was just noted that once you enter into that MSE avenue, it's quite unusual to maintain an annual decision-making process. The Commission, of course, has indicated that that's what it would like to continue with, which doesn't quite align with this recommendation.
Go ahead, Mr. Degree.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't able to actually participate in this. I was commercially fishing, and yeah, I regret. I did get some emails, and I kind of followed along, and I was really pleased with the recommendations that my fellow commissioners came up with, or inputs they put in. For recommendation number 9, I was just curious how the IPHC staff are going to be involved to facilitate with the contracting parties and monitor how it's going to move forward. Sorry.
Thank you. Through the chair. This is a general recommendation coming from the panel, and it's more directed at contracting parties, and that's why we have it specifically highlighted here in terms of responsibility. The Secretariat does record and report in its fisheries statistics paper observer coverage rates by fleet and by area, but we certainly do not participate in determining those rates. That's purely left at the moment up to the contracting parties. That's probably where it should lie.
I guess I have a follow-up question there. I assume that's observer coverage in the directed halibut fishery. And I also have a question about when you say level of fishing intensity, does that mean what is fishing intensity in that context? Is it the number of boats? Is it the amount of fish in a given area? Is it, I don't know what fishing intensity means.
Thank you, Chair. So the 2 elements there in terms of tackle the last, the fishing intensity. The panel left it deliberately vague because it was recognised, and we did advise them that this is an individual contracting party responsibility, and the way to compare observer coverage and determine what a rate should be in relation to fishing activity, let's call it, it does differ by fleet, by gear, and by area. And so the reason that they left it so vague, as we're saying, with the level of intensity, is to provide that latitude for the contracting parties to determine how the observer coverage rates would be measured by fleet, by gear. And so whether it be, for example, trawl hours versus trawl catch versus trawl interactions with Pacific halibut versus hooks in the water versus vessel days, those types of things, the panel took a hands-off approach and didn't want to dive in too deep into the technical details of determining what that level of fishing would be in terms of intensity. In terms of your question about whether it was just about the directed fishery, no, the panel took a broader view that their review was a holistic impact analysis, for want of a better description, of all interactions with Pacific halibut. And so again, we left vague so that it would be left up to the contracting parties to determine whether it should be limited to a directed fishery versus non-directed fisheries. And that's why it's vague.
Now I have to go back. What action is what is actually the action that this commission would be taking relative to these recommendations? Are you looking for us to approve these recommendations in a package or one by one? Because the vagueness of that one, given the vagueness of that one, I couldn't possibly agree to approve it.
Thank you, Chair. And so the intention is for the Commission, as per the first performance review, to consider each of these recommendations and advise whether you would like them to be carried forward or not, or some variance to that. For example, the first performance review, there are a number of recommendations arising to restructure the commissioner composition on the commission, and the commission made a very specific decision not to advance that recommendation. And so this is the point where the commission says yes or no, you'd like us to proceed to improve performance of the commission and the secretariat with each of these recommendations. And so in this case, as you can see, the secretariat has highlighted that the responsibility is with the contracting parties. And so the commission would now decide whether you would like us to report out on any particular detail, or whether at this time you feel that you wouldn't like the secretariat to address this on an annual basis.
for example, using that number 9 as the example, if we were to say we agree with that or approve that, well, number 1, I'm not sure what I'm agreeing to. Number 2, it's not within the Secretariat's purview or the Commission's purview, it's the contracting party's purview, and therefore it'd be difficult for me to approve something for which I'm obligating the United States, and I don't know what I actually am obligating the United States to.
Yeah, just further on, recommendation number 9. Just to tie in the discussion, was there any mention of any international standards, or is there any standard boards that would be associated?
Thank you. Through the chair. There was discussion, not extensive discussion, but there was discussion around international best practice for observer coverage rates, and how representative those observer coverage rates by gear, by fleet, spatially in terms of the fishing effort for a particular fishery. But there was nothing more detailed than that. If I was to put forward be so bold as to put forward a suggestion, is that this is something that is being reported out by the Secretariat already. It's part of the fishery statistics paper. The contracting parties also include in their national reports updates on observer coverage rates for various fleets. That could be to sort of a maintain status quo situation if you would like it to leave it as contracting party responsibility. And then in the comments, it's just simply status quo reporting by contracting parties and the Secretariat through paper 05 fishery statistics. That would essentially maintain us at status quo and mean we wouldn't provide any additional update on a periodic basis other than what we're already doing. The alternative is to indicate that you would like to remove this recommendation and not endorse it moving forward and just leave it solely to status quo in an informal sense. Or if you did adopt it, you would then have to consider how you would like it to be applied. Would you like the Secretariat to get involved in the contracting party processes? And it doesn't sound as though you want that, so there's three ways forward for you to consider.
Apologies for the sidebar there. Go ahead, Mr. Ryall.
I'm just wondering if we could go through these at a high level and see if there's common agreement on ones that we do not wish to pursue at all at this time. And I'm sure there'll be, and maybe this number 9 is one that we may not totally agree, but maybe there's others that we do agree that we don't want to proceed. And for example, if we go back to recommendation number 1, about the legal analysis, of they're recommending that consideration be given to updating the convention at the next opportunity. I guess from Canada's point of view is we're not interested in undertaking that as this is written. There are other ways of taking some of the things into consideration that we're already doing through policy, but don't see the need to update the convention. At least that'd be our point of view. And so we wouldn't even put low on this. We would say, not going to do it.
So since you brought this example up, Mr. Ryall, how does number 1 and 2 relate or interact?
Well, I guess number 2 is more along the lines of what I was saying, is that we would seek alternative mechanisms to implement the national best practices, which would be along the lines of what we're already doing without updating the convention, is the way I would interpret number 2.
Because number 2 reads, recommend to update the convention while in the interim period seek alternative mechanisms.
Right. So I mean, I think we have latitude to modify these to undertake what we want to do. They're provided as recommendations, and so if we, for example, we agree that number 1 is not something we want to undertake, but number 2 is we would like to see improvements in a number of areas. They're using the words international best practices and legal principles. It could be phrased that we will be undertaking that. And it could be in the spirit of that, but it doesn't. I don't see we're obligated to strictly adhere to the recommendation. It's up to us to decide how we would like to see these implemented.
And this, I guess, this conversation, how do I say this? This reminds me that I probably haven't paid close enough attention to this. There's 26 something recommendations here, and I would need some time to confer with my U.S. delegation on some of these before going through them one by one, I think.
Yeah, I think that was done with the first performance review. And so I think that would be useful for both parties to do that and spend a bit more time on this. Clearly, number 1 was causing you some heartburn, but I guess we also did talk about in our agreement last year about having a work plan around monitoring. And so number 9 has some of the work that we already identified to undertake. So I think maybe what you're proposing is to spend a bit more time within your delegation to come up with your view on what you'd like to see for each one of these recommendations. I know for myself, having a chance to go through this and having some internal discussion, but maybe not enough either, that I can see there's a number of them that I don't think we'll be doing, in my view, and I'm sure you probably come to the conclusion on some of those as well within your delegation that you just don't think that those are worth doing at this point in time. And there are others where we'll have a common agreement, I'm sure, and others may be a little more challenging.
Something we need to try to find the time somehow to do within the next few days.
Hey, Chair. I think we have developed a very robust interprofessional process now, and I would suggest that if contracting parties haven't had a chance yet to review the proposed priorities, recommendations, and the status, that as Canada has pointed out, that we move it to that intersessional process, noting that we don't need to report out on this again until the work meeting and then the interim meeting later this year. There are, as you can see in the updates to status, ongoing work which you've already directed the Secretary to undertake, such as the MSC, for example. Our plate is certainly full enough to moving on those without worrying too much about if there's agreement to the others. The direction's already been set for a number of these recommendations. And so, Chair, as a way forward, I would suggest it's very clear, and the panel recognized that, noting that we had 2 contracting parties on the panel, that recommendation 1 wouldn't be palatable, which is why they introduced that second component. And if we were to move forward for the contracting parties to take a detailed look at this, provide responses to any recommendations that you're uncomfortable with or you would not like to see pursued, changing the priority and providing additional direction, we could incorporate that into a consolidated version and circulate that into session for agreement.
That would work for us. The other, maybe just an overarching comment I would make. The first performance review, remind me how many recommendations there were, Dave, 30 or so?
There was a lot more. I can't remember the number off the top of my
Yeah,
head.
and there was a number of those clearly that the commission at the time decided that they were not going to embark upon for various reasons. Dave outlined one, but there were others as well. And I think as well that the ones that were implemented, as Dave has reported over the course of years, have been, for the most part, fully implemented. And my view overall is that there has been significant progress made from the first performance review to this one. And so I think we have made good progress over time. And I think that if we spend a little bit more time on this and come back together, that we can tease out the ones that are important to us in this one without spending time here right now, once you've had a chance to further assess what you would like to see happen. There's one other piece that I was looking at that's not a recommendation. If I can, it was, they're noted, but I've just looking for them. Can't find them now. I'll come back to it.
Yes. In the meantime, and my apologies for not paying close enough attention to this prior to right now, but certainly I think, yeah, can you clarify for me, Dr. also how we deal with, if we don't have, let's say we don't have time right now, or perhaps even this week to go through every one of these, how will we deal this intersessional? How will we deal with this intersessionally?
Thank you, Chair. What it will mean is we will resend the paper to yourselves as commissioners and any advisors that you would like us to send it to. You then make amendments and comments to each of these recommendations in the table of whether you feel that it's a not applicable priority, for example, recommendation 1. And then for recommendation 2, a suggested alternative. The Commission recommends that in the interim, that alternative may be sought. So you're providing variations to the wording of how you would like to proceed, and then changing the priorities and responsibilities, timelines. So it would be those first, the second, third, fourth, and fifth columns that you would provide comments on. We would then consolidate those into one document with Canada, US, where there's agreement. You could probably move forward with that. Where there's disagreement, we would hold the intersessional meeting where we're discussing the financial regs and such, and go through that to see if there was agreement between the two contracting parties. And then we could adopt the table moving forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your patience. That would work for me. Looking at my fellow commissioners. Go ahead, Mr. Degree.
Yeah, are the sessional sessions, are they scheduled? Myself, I'm very busy during the year, commercial fishing. I would like to have be able to participate, but it would be helpful for me if I know a scheduling.
Thank you. Through the chair, at the moment they're not scheduled. What I would suggest is that very soon after this meeting, we would have a clear number of topics such as the financial regs, the rules of procedure potentially, and the performance review paper that need to be discussed. And so we'll develop an agenda, probably a Monday morning next week, and distribute that and have a call for expected timelines when we would have the material fully ready for you to consider. And then we could have a discussion around availability of commissioners to have that discussion.
Thank you.
The computer problems, user malfunction. Okay, if that's an acceptable path forward, I certainly concur with that path forward. Thank you. Mr. Ryall.
Yes, and we concur as well. And I found the paragraphs that I was looking for earlier. They're paragraph 23 and 24 in the
Sorry, Tom, I just closed the document. Would you open the actual report itself? Apologies for that. Thank you.
Uh, 23, 24. I know these are noted, not recommendations, but I guess when I read these, I thought maybe they should be recommendations. And given some of the conversations we've had over the course of this meeting, I was wondering if this was a need that we should basically think about how to add to the list, I guess, Chris. It speaks about some the following this increase. So talking about that I think this is following the increased transparency. I think it deals with the first performance review, but there could be further benefit derived from explicitly clarifying the roles, responsibilities, and respective authorities of the commission, commissioners, the secretariat, and various subsidiary bodies. And then it goes on to speak about some confusion about stakeholders regarding those authorities. And so I think I've noted I just open it for discussion. Others feel the same. And if it's only me, that's fine. Ignore paragraph 23, 24. But it just seems that there could be something that we could do on these two items.
I would agree. I don't know what we need to do. I guess, are you suggesting we move it from a note to a recommendation?
Yeah, basically it would be included in the joint table that we put together. Yeah.
I would look for other commissioners' comments, but I would agree there's merit in that.
I assume we are meeting that goal now with our current processes.
I think we have done a lot, Bob, from the first performance review, but I guess it still seems to be some confusion involved, I would say, about roles of responsibility. And so I think it would be useful to spend a little more time on this and then have a discussion within the plenary session at the interim meeting, for example. And if not, then at the annual meeting a year from now.
Go ahead, Richard.
I concur that I think, just experiencing from stakeholders from this meeting, they felt that there wasn't much transparency in last year's decision making, whether it was accurate or not. There's just some confusion as to defining not necessarily defining the roles of the commissioners and the representative bodies, but defining what really is transparency. There is periods of times that, and especially last year was very difficult because it was a negotiating year, and the feeling was that that the stakeholders were involved in a lot of the negotiations. Maybe they inserted. I'm just, I guess, trying to clarify really what is the term transparency and how is it defined at what stages of decision making. I mean, there is some confusion, and maybe that's what, in the interviews that these, in the review, maybe that surfaced to some point. I'm not quite sure, but.
Not sure I was thinking in the same context of that particular process, but perhaps it's subsumed within this broad, what I would see as some rather broad notes.
Yeah, I was thinking more generally than just this year. I think, and my response to Bob's question, I think there has been a huge improvement in transparency about how the commission operates. We have, for example, this session is open to any that wish to attend. There's opportunity for public comment at all sessions. So with few exceptions, there's openness and transparency, in my view, to all the sessions of that commission, which was not there previously. And as well, the amounts of record of each of the meetings has been much clearer in the last number of years than previously for what's been discussed and recommended and adopted. So I think all those records are available to everyone at any particular time. When maybe everyone's not totally aware of all that, but I would say we have done our job to make sure that all that is out there for the public record, and there's opportunities for everyone to have input and to raise questions, which was somewhat lacking in before that. I won't say it's totally lacking, but it was less. And we've made improvements.
I would note that number 20, there is a recommendation, number 20, on governance transparency, recommend that the significant level of transparency achieved across commission business continue to be improved. I don't know if that quite captures this. I just recall that. And I certainly don't have any objection to perhaps expanding number 20 to better capture what's in these two notes. All right, well, thank you for the way forward so that we have an opportunity to review these more closely with our, certainly speaking for the U.S. side, and then we can try to resolve them intersessionally.
Thank you, Chair. There's currently no public comment that's received for either of the two agenda items, and therefore we can either break early for a coffee break before we come back to revisit the regulatory proposals for 2020 that were presented yesterday. Thank you, Chair. And the FIS presentation. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, let's go ahead and take a break then. It's a little after 10:20. Let's take a little bit longer break, try to get back though at 10:40. So it gives us about 19 minutes.
Ready to move to Belly?
Thank you, Rich.
Satellite. Yeah. It is a crazy rent increase. But we say 24 personnel, 22 or 32, or 33. But I mean, if you looked at the prices, it was, if I read it right, it's on the IPHC document, it was either 370 or 370,000 a year.
For me?
That's I don't want to pay $100,000. That should be built into part of the concept. Yeah.
We can't even lease them.
It takes so long. Yeah.
It's still be in the purchase contract.
Yes. That's the other thing they were talking about. Currently lost 1.2 million compared to what was projected.
Yeah, that's what, yeah.
It needs two pieces to that. It's based on the cash rates. True, at 3, but I think that's always clear. That's two pieces. But, and it's a fair answer. If we knew the answer to that, we would fish for who would be running the stock. We would better his job. But, I'm not quite certain. It's like, they agreed in that signing off that document, they would continue to look at the difference between the account and the budgeted amount and find where is the cost. But to my understanding, that was somewhere to $200,000 they need to clear up the budget for 2020. So someone's gonna get laid out. Someone's gonna get downstairs. It's gonna be he's shaping kind of, yeah. Someone's gonna go. All right. So does that season? So it's like, where's that comfort? But there's always been a risk to that. Yeah. But I was never sort of, yeah. Bruce used to come to me and say, look, we gotta burn through $100, so I didn't even be a marker. So we would, but I would never do it because in practice, you can control a bunch of those things. And the other one was, it was outside of our comfort level to just expensive flights, extended stays at hotels, so whatever did it. And so then he would joke and say, I can't get you good credit sure because it burns my money. It's like, yeah, nice. And he was always talking cheap and loud about it, right? I also get why they want to cry. So mine is refusing to update.
This is what you would go up, go find the person, and I would kind of go find Glenn, you know, and I was like, how come a minute before?
And today I'm getting last street. I'm like, how are you getting stuff out there?
And then I'm only getting half.
Yeah.
Like notifications.
Yeah.
Keep looking.
Yeah, I'm the same. I'm the exact same.
Like that was actually that was ours.
Mine are two different ones. One CB is capitalized, one CB is lowercase.
Oh, yeah, yeah. No, you're right.
So-
Sent something.
so-
that
so-
I never got.
Yeah, so I think she was getting anxious about it. I don't know if Steve's aware, the one that just came
But
in.
she sent a minute. That was just.
Come back to order. I'll turn it over to Mr. Wilson or Mr. Keith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If we could just have the PowerPoint for the regulatory proposals. This is one of the chances in the agenda for you to talk about the regulatory proposals. And what I plan to do is update you with what I know about recommendations concerning them so far, and any questions that we know about that you may want to consider, and then open it for your discussion. And I don't see it. Oh, it's not on our screen.
We have some
Oh, there we go.
prompts.
Up, it's coming up. Right, if you could go to the next slide there, or I can go to the next slide there. Right, so unless you'd like to do anything other than this, I'll just go through them in the order that they appear. The fishery limits, as I mentioned yesterday, the only change in the format of that particular regulation is to add the table of your TCEY decisions to the fishery regulations. In the past, the actual decisions that you make each year have not been in the regulations, but everything derivative from them has been. So this is to make it clear what elements are decided by the commission and what elements of sector allocations, for instance, derive from the decisions made by the commission. I will say that the only comment I've had about that so far was a question about whether they should be called limits or not, the TCEY mortality limit decisions. And our position is that they are limits. They are in fact limits that you're setting on mortality that can be taken out of the water in each of the regulatory areas. And the suggestion was that it should be values, but they are in fact limits that you're setting, and that's exactly what the convention allows you to do. So far, that's the only thing I've heard about proposal A1, other than obviously filling in the boxes. So I'm just talking about the shape of the boxes, and the rest of your discussions for the rest of the week are filling in the boxes.
So I was trying to pick up on a nuance of yours, Steve, and when we approve these catch sharing plans in different areas, were you suggesting how they're derived, or is that what you're trying to suggest in part of your comment there? That there would be some flow of where that action goes or comes from?
Through the chair, yes, Commissioner Allison, yes, indeed. Actually, all of the sector allocations are derived from the decision that you make at TCEY. So when you make TCEY, then we figure out what the FCEY is. They enter the catch sharing plans. So they're not your catch sharing plans. They're the domestic agency's catch sharing plans. You simply note that the catch sharing plans exist and that the allocations will be made according to them, and you are providing the top line mortality limit into which all of those plans have to fit. And that's never actually been made clear in the regulations, that this is the commission decision and everything else derives from it. And so that's what we're attempting to do by adding this table at the top.
So follow up, in the past, we made motions like for the catch sharing plan from Pacific Council or the check 1 and 2C or 3A. We won't be making that type of motion. We'll be just making a TCEY action.
To the chair, actually, that's correct. You don't actually need to do that. What you do is you note them. You note the catch sharing plans because they're actually approved by the domestic agencies in each case, and you are providing them the allocation, which or the limit which can be taken out of the water in each regulatory area, and they are applying it through their domestic process to figure out what the various sector allocations are.
So follow up again, Chris, does this push the regulatory process in the U.S. through Magnuson Act, or does it through the Halibut Commission Act? Does this create a problem for us?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Allison, no. It's exactly what we've been doing all along. We're just simply noting it in a more correct way, because it's not your catch sharing plan, it's the Pacific Council's catch sharing plan, or it's the Fisheries and Oceans Canada catch arrangement between commercial and the rec sector. But you note that they exist.
Further questions on that item?
Okay. Right, then, so the fishing periods, you can think of this as two elements. The first element is the overall commercial fishing period. And we proposed that the dates be fixed. In the past, you have fixed, in other words, from year to year, they would always be the same. That's what we have proposed. Last year and the year before, you decided not to do that, and the subsidiary bodies also recommended not doing that. They may recommend that again. At any rate, both of the subsidiary bodies are coming up with recommendations for you for dates for those. You've probably heard them already. The second part of that proposal has to do particularly with IPHC Regulatory Area 2A and the non-tribal directed commercial fishery, which takes place there, which you still set the management measures for, the dates and the when the fishing takes place. And as we talked about yesterday, in our proposal, we proposed either a 2-day or a 3-day fishing period. We're happy with either one. We just really want to get away from the 10-hour period. That's our motivation in recommending this to you. During the course of the year, there's been extensive conversation, and I will note that the Pacific Fishery Management Council sent you a letter and noting that in their November meeting, they recommended the 3-day. I will also note that they recommended that the fishing period begin on Monday instead of Wednesday. So currently, in this past year and years before, the 10-hour derbies have been taking place on Wednesdays. And so they recommended a 3-day fishing period that ends on Wednesday, starts on Monday. So that would be the only change from the text that we have proposed in the actual regulatory proposal. So any questions about that?
So Steve, so I assume because it came through the Pacific Council, that there was adequate time for stakeholder involvement in that process and testimony, and the decisions vetted through that process through the council?
Through the chair, Commissioner Imada, yes, indeed. I went to the November meeting and there was a lot of conversation about that, a lot of input. And it was also the result of a continuing conversation because they had actually considered this question at several previous meetings as well. So there was quite a bit of stakeholder input on that.
Mr. Davis.
I think these proposed changes are sensible. I don't foresee having any issue with them per se, but I wonder, are we hearing from a council representative about the nature of their progress in getting this out of the IPHC's hair, for lack of a better term? Clearly they have the intent. I'm interested in knowing a more concrete timeline for the completion and transition. And so do we have that? And if not, are we hearing from the council this week to discuss that?
Okay. Yeah, through the chair, Commissioner Davis, we do not have that timeline. We are part of that conversation. And unfortunately, the council representative who was here has already left because he had to go attend another meeting to better answer that. But it is on their next meeting is a month from now. And I'll be attending that meeting. And it is on the agenda to talk about the transition and the process and the timeline for that. The Secretary's position throughout has been that we're happy to do it tomorrow, and they are working through the process. From my point of view, what I observe is that for them, it's an issue of trying to fit it into the U.S. domestic regulatory process and how they would make that work with the least amount of added effort because they don't have additional resources to put to it.
So, yeah, we all struggle with that.
And perhaps I could ask Ms. Mattis from Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife to comment on that because she is part of this conversation and has been throughout.
Through the chair, I'm not a council member. I'm one of the people who will likely be doing the analysis in the background. And I think Mr. Keith spoke to it well. We are in the process. The council process takes a little bit longer time. In the November briefing book, NIMS put out a calendar of what we're going to be working on and the proposed timeline. It's going to start this year with trying to figure out the licensing part first, how NIMS can take over the licensing part. And I think Mr. Lockhart spoke to that there's 3 options on that. That will be the first part of it, and then getting it all set up to who can do next, who can work on next. It is on our March agenda to be discussed more, and I think it's on the April and or June agendas as well. So it is actively being worked on. Some of us who are the minions behind the scenes are also working on things that we would need to accomplish for the federal NEPA analysis and to meet Magnuson standards. So hopefully that helps you some.
Thank you. It does help. I would be interested to see the calendar and the proposed timeline, and I'm interested to know if that can be translated or understood as a commitment to the completion of this transition within a period of time, or if it's something softer than that.
Okay, through the chair, if I could interrupt, I see that Mr. Anderson has come back into the room and perhaps he could shed some light on that question.
Mr. Anderson would be better than myself to answer that one as a council member.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. The question that Commissioner Davis asked was about, and he can ask it again, of course, is about the council's process for the transition of management of the fisheries in regulatory area 2A.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the question. As Lynn indicated, we're actively pursuing a process and schedule for the transition. It is more difficult. Well, it's more difficult than at least I thought it would be in terms of implementing and going through the steps within NOAA Fisheries to get the transition completed. At this point, I don't think we would be prepared to, we can provide you a draft schedule, but I would stop short of being able to provide you a schedule that was a final schedule. And there are different components of the transition. There's the regulatory measures associated with the commercial fishery, particularly from an in-season perspective. Those are easier from an implementation perspective than the recreational, the in-season management measures associated with the recreational fishery, which there are a number of in-season management measures that need to be taken as fisheries approach their quotas and need to be closed. And then there's the licensing piece, which appears to be more straightforward. So I could envision something that would be doing this in increments over a several year time period through 2022 or perhaps 2023 in order to get the entire transition completed. NOAA's working hard to take it in investigating the timeline and the steps that need to be taken in order to make the full transition. So I would be happy after we're going to have a discussion at the March council meeting about the transition. It's a continuing conversation. The NOAA Fisheries is working closely with the states in that regard. And once we have that, after we have an additional conversation in March, we can provide you some more specificity in the way of a schedule and the transition steps. We would be happy to do so. And Mr. Keith has been very helpful and has been attending most of our council meetings where this topic has been on our agenda. So we are working closely with the Secretariat staff as we move forward.
I think that would be helpful and welcome to see what that schedule or timeline looks like. And I'd be interested to see whatever the council puts together after your March meeting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question.
Steve, on this 2A opening, I'm looking at the paper where it says IPHC halibut fishery regulations, section 9 there. And I see an opening date of the 24th of June, but I don't see where I can find what the Pacific Council, they had a different date, I think, than that. Can you help me with that?
Right. Yeah, through the chair, Mr. Alderson, it would be the 22nd of June. It would be the Monday before that. They phrased their recommendation in terms of the fourth Monday in June as a continuing thing. In our proposal, we actually put in the dates for 2020, which, so the Wednesday was the 26th of June, I think, or the 24th of June, and then it would be that same week. So if you approve this regulatory proposal, you can tell us whether you want it to be on the 22nd or the 24th or the fourth Monday, or however you want to express it.
And our law enforcement are recommending an opening hour. I saw noon to noon someplace, but I also heard 8 and then a noon closing, or 1800 hours closing.
To the chair, Commissioner Alderson, all those different options about opening and closing times were discussed, for instance, at the Pacific Council when they were talking about it. And our recommendation was to start at 0800 and to close at 1800, which are the times that we use right now for the 10-hour derby. And in the end, that's what the Pacific Council recommendation was to open at 08 on the first day and close at 18 on the third day.
Further questions or comments, Mr. Degree?
Thank you, Steve. One question I have, were there any of the statements from industry? Were there any statements from industry regarding this? I've tried to go through as many of those as I could, but there seems to be quite a few. I appreciate that you've done the poll, but I would just be curious if there were any statements.
Through the chair, Commissioner Degree, there are a couple of statements in the stakeholder statements document, info 1, number 7 and number 8 in particular, as well as number 1. So 1, 7, and 8 have to do particularly with the commercial fishery in regulatory area 2A.
Thank you.
Further questions? Okay, let's move on.
Right, so proposal A3 is the minor amendments. As we discussed yesterday, the principal amendment is to change the order of the regulations themselves to make them flow in a more logical way and make them more useful. In our conversation with our agency partners, we have had a couple of recommendations on how the wording might be tweaked in there, and we are meeting with the agency representatives this afternoon, and we will talk about any other recommendations or minor amendments to the minor amendments that they may recommend. But other than that, I have nothing further to add right now, unless you have any questions about them.
I see no questions. You'll be meeting this afternoon and then perhaps have additional detail when we revisit this later in the agenda.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You have time on the agenda tomorrow morning to talk about regulatory proposals as well. And if there's anything new, that we'll certainly be bringing it to you at that point.
Thank you.
Then the proposal A4 is fairly straightforward. It has to do with vessel clearances in IPHC regulatory area 4. And in our regulations, there's a requirement that vessels fishing in those regulatory areas, it's actually for A, B, C, and D, any require clearance in and out of the area to document basically where they are fishing. And currently in the IPHC regulations, IPHC fishery regulations, there's an exemption for vessels that have an operating VMS system, vessel monitoring system. They don't need to get the clearance. And the proposal is to add a couple of other exemptions. So in addition to having a vessel monitoring system, a VMS, if you have a fishery observer on board, or if you have a working electronic monitoring system, you would also not need to obtain a clearance. This has been the subject of conversation with our enforcement friends over the last couple of years, and we have the language which appears in the proposal is the language that we've all agreed to that would be workable for them. We thought it made sense to add these further exemptions because these are other systems that track where the vessel is, and so it's known where they've been fishing.
So when we get to action on these, do we just make a motion to approve something like this as found in Appendix A, as it indicates here?
Through the chair, Commissioner Alderson, yes, you would adopt this proposal. And adopting the proposal brings with it the language which is contained in the appendix.
Further questions? Let's just move on.
Okay, the IPHC closed area is the subject of our proposal A5. And we are bringing this to you this year because you asked us to do that 2 years ago when the last time you considered it. The reason we're recommending eliminating the closed area is that we, the Secretariat, see no need to keep the directed commercial or directed Pacific halibut fisheries out of that area. It was originally established to prevent any fishing on Pacific halibut. It was established before the 200-mile limits were established, when there was extensive foreign trawling in that part of the ocean. And since then, the fishery management situation has evolved to where the only fishing activity which is not allowed in that area is the directed Pacific halibut fishery. There's a considerable amount of non-directed fishery mortality that is taken out of the water in that area. So there's no real point in keeping it closed to the directed fishery, and so that's what we recommend. Saying that is relatively simple. The management implications of that are much more complicated because it would involve questions of who fishes there and how you manage that fishery and whose quota is good there, and all those attendant questions, which are actually not yours, but they are the province of the North Pacific Fishery Management Council. And so any move to eliminate the closed area would necessarily entail a conversation with the domestic management authorities on how that piece of the ocean would then be managed in terms of the directed fisheries. We point out that opening it to the directed fishery does not create new fish. That area is part of 4CD&E for purposes of the stock assessment. It's surveyed. The portion of the stock that lives there is well known to us, so it wouldn't change overall TCE-wise, but it is a question about how you would manage access to that area. And there's various forms that this could take. You could say that it's no longer prohibited to the directed fishery, but the North Pacific Council would have to take some affirmative action about who could actually fish there. So there could be many different ways of doing this. And so it's up to you on how you'd like to proceed. But the reason it's here now is because you asked us to bring it back to you. At the time you deferred it 2 years ago, part of your reasoning was that the abundance-based management process was still ongoing at the North Pacific Council.
So Steve, let's say we voted to eliminate this area. The domestic fleet would not necessarily be able to enter that until say the North Pacific Council had passed regulations to define who participates. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, through the chair, Mr. Alverson, that's what we're saying. We obviously want to ask them that question and see what they think, get their input on it. But until they change their regulations, but it is somewhat more complicated than that, because it depends on how their regulations are defined in terms of geography. And what would you call this area? Would it be 4F? Would it be part of 4E? How would it be managed? But
They would have to take proactive action.
Yes. Okay. There would have to be affirmative action on the part of the domestic management system to regulate who fishes there and what quota they use.
So Steve, what's the comments you've been hearing so far? Because this is something that probably they're aware of. So do they see this as a big issue, a big problem, or a very complicated matter to deal with?
Through the chair, Commissioner Yamada, I really can't answer for them. I suspect it is fairly complicated for them to deal with, but I think that we need to ask them that question.
Yeah, and I guess having not been intimately involved with the council process recently, have we asked them what they think about this lately?
Mr. Chairman, we've talked about it. We talked about it 2 years ago. We talked about it in the run-up to this. They know that our position is that it no longer needs to be closed to the directed fishery, and that it would take work on their part to figure out what to do if it's no longer close to the directed fishery.
I guess I'm trying to explore whether there is a willingness on their part to tackle that problem, tackle that issue, or if the commission were to just do it, then I guess what would be the effect of the commission's removing the closed area if in fact they decline to tackle that question?
Mr. Chairman, I think we can ask them what the outcome would be. I think the outcome would be essentially nothing would happen. The directed fleet would not be able to fish there yet because they're not allowed to by domestic regulation. The action you take on this could range from doing nothing to adopting it as it is to something in between. For instance, you could say that you intend to eliminate the closed area in the coming years, or you would like to do it in next year or in 2 years, or you'd like to engage the North Pacific Council on how to move forward with this. So there's a range of options that you might wish to consider, and I don't want to speak for the North Pacific Council or the National Marine Fisheries Service, and I'm sure you'll get lots of input from them on that question. Our entering argument from the Secretariat's point of view is that there's no reason that the directed fishery should be excluded from this part of the ocean, so it doesn't make any sense to maintain it in the IPHC regulations. But we recognize it has significant management implications that involve other parties, not us.
Speaking for myself, I'd be hesitant to go down this road without further discourse on the issue with the council and perhaps myself. Mr. Ryall.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think Steve answered most of my question about, okay, from the IPHC point of view, it's not providing any benefit given the changing circumstances over time with other fisheries now able to fish in that area that were not allowed to fish in that, or were not fishing in that area when this was first put in place. But maybe just a follow-up question, Steve, is so besides maybe clearing up a regulation on the IPHC books, what's the benefit to directed fishery one way or the other? I don't notice that there is, I could be totally wrong, but I don't notice that there's a big push to go fishing in that area. So what are we accomplishing?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ryall, there's not a hue and cry to go fishing in that area. And indeed, there are not a lot of Pacific halibut in the area. It's probably not an area that would see a lot of fishing pressure if the domestic fishery were there. So it's not pressing in that regard. It's just a matter of our mandate. The commission's mandate is also is to maintain the fishery, and we don't see any reason why the fishery should not have access to that part of the ocean. So it's not like we have a lot of stakeholders asking us why they can't be in there.
Okay, so just commented, following up on Paul's question, that I would agree with you in principle. There's no reason to keep directed fishery out of there. On the other hand, just as a point of principle, I'm not sure it's worth creating what might be kind of a regulatory nightmare. So, Mr. Alverson.
So as a heads up, I'm probably going to recommend that we table this until our working meeting in the fall and retake it up there if it needs to be. There's an issue developing in the crab industry where they are going to be at the king crab resource next year may not have an opening. And they're looking at when I say the crab industry may be asking the North Pacific Council for some habitat protection that abuts about a third or a quarter of this area that we've closed. So I'd kind of like to see how that discussion goes over between now and the fall. So that'd be the reason, another reason for tabling it.
Can you tell us a little more about that, Bob? Would that be a request to exclude other fisheries in order to achieve that habitat protection? Is that what that means?
I think the crabbers, there's currently a closure, and I can't remember the longitudinal line of it, but it butts right up against our closed area. And so it would be a no bottom trawl closure that they would be asking for. And it would affect the Amendment 80 fleet that we testifies here, primarily in their yellowfin sole fishery, I think.
Steve,
Also, if I may, we could probably I can get more information on this, but there are other areas in the Bering Sea that are protected for different species, such as blue crabs around the Pribilofs that exclude bottom contact gear. And so, for instance, even though you approved the use of pots in the Bering Sea a couple of years ago, they can't actually use them in all parts of the Bering Sea because of these kinds of protected areas.
further questions on this one?
Well, I mean, I think for the reasons that Bob and others have mentioned, it would be worth revisiting this when we have a little more information in hand. It would be interesting to me to see what areas are proposed for additional closures, how they map onto the current closed area for the IPHC closed area, and to use all of that in a discussion about where to from here.
Agreed. Right. No further comments. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll just move on to the, oops, maybe I'll move on. There we go. So there are two regulatory proposals from the contracting parties. The first one is the one you see each year, actually. It's from the NOAA Fisheries Alaska Region Office, and it's the charter management measures for IPHC regulatory areas 2C and 3A. As you know, the process is for the North Pacific Fishery Management Council through its Charter Management Committee, to make recommendations to you each year for management measures that will keep those two sectors within the allocation that they get as part of the catch sharing plan. So there's several moving pieces there, but what happens is that you set a TCEY from the resulting FCEY. The catch sharing plan then establishes an allocation for the charter recreational fisheries in each of those two regulatory areas. And depending on what that allocation is, They have a suite of management measures in increasing order of restriction that are applied depending on what the allocation turns out to be. And because of the timing of the process, they make the recommendation to you in time for the annual meeting. You act on it, and then it becomes part of IPHC fishery regulations, and then can be enacted in time for the charter fisheries in Alaska. As you well know, there has been a lot of stakeholder input on this particular one because of the potential allocation in IPHC regulatory area 3A. So from the Secretariat's point of view, we recommend adoption of this proposal because it is the recommended management measures for those two sectors. So in terms of this proposal itself, we recommend its adoption. Right. And then
I don't, Bob, go ahead, Bob has a question.
So on this, I noticed a whole bunch of language that goes with this under suggested regulatory language. So to simplify our action, what do we move to adopt?
through the chair, Commissioner Alderson. So you can simply adopt a proposal, and then the proposal comes with it the language that is conditional, and it specifies if for whatever the allocation happens to be, what the management measures are. So one of the things that will take place on Friday morning when you make TCEY decisions is we in conjunction with our agency friends will figure out what that turns into, and we can tell you what the management measures will be. And that's the language that will appear in the fishery regulations. So you can, in terms of process, you can simply adopt this proposal, and it includes with it the various conditions about which management measures are adopted depending on the allocation which is assigned.
Sort of a formulaic.
Yes, sir. It's very formulaic for each of the two regulatory areas.
I know we addressed this last year in Area 2C when it was only a few hundred pounds that through the formula would have meant a difference of an inch in size. And we had a discussion, and I think we approved some language last year that said that given the situation in just specifically 2C, that they were under allocation over the past few years, that the methodology they were using wasn't really, performing well. And so whatever, so this, although there's a formula, we had given some kind of flexibility that it was very close to that particular target that we had, like in that last year, so we could vary an inch, so like so it was just 100 pounds less than the formula that they would still pick the more liberal inch. And I don't know if we're going to be facing that same scenario this year, but so before we, press the button and after we make the TCYs and Sarah Webster goes and, does her math and spits out a harvest measure for the area 2C and 3A, where do we have the flexibility to have that same thing done in this year's regulatory setting of harvest measures?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Yamada, we will not ask you to finally approve this particular proposal until that point in the proceedings on Friday. So we'll ask for your final approval of this or action on this proposal after you know what the resulting management measures are.
So that will be the appropriate time to make any adjustments to that formula if we had to. Okay,
Yes.
I just want to know where the opportunity would be. Thanks.
Further questions? Okay, let's move on.
Thank you. The proposal B2 is a simple change of wording in one place in the fishery regulations, and it has to do with how subarea 2A1 is defined. And the relevance of subarea 2A1 is it's the delineation between the areas occupied by the treaty tribe fisheries, and to the north and to the south of the directed commercial fisheries. The reason for the change is that there have been several recent court cases in the United States that have to do with the usual and accustomed fishing areas for the various treaty tribes in Washington. And the language proposed by the National Marine Fisheries Service reflects those recent court cases. We recommend approval of this proposal. It simplifies our regulations with respect to how it's defined. It simply lists it as Point Chehalis. It doesn't change where people fish and who gets to fish. It just simply changes how that line is defined.
Okay, then I think we can move on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are two regulatory proposals that came to you from stakeholders, and both of these have to do with recreational fisheries in Alaska. One of them proposes a uniform set of management measures to apply to all recreational fishers in Alaska. So in other words, charter as well as the unguided sectors. The other one is similar, although it is phrased as a uniform bag limit for all non-Alaska resident fishers in Alaska. Our recommendation to you on these proposals is the same for each proposal, is that the proponent be referred to the North Pacific Fishery Management Council, which is the proper arena to consider these kinds of changes, because these are the subject of domestic fisheries management.
And just a reminder, the first one, from Jay Kearns, what is the consistent measure they're proposing?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I could bring it up, but I believe it's essentially the same bag limit applying to, it's the one fish or two fish bag limit, or one fish of any size across the, thank you, Tom. Yeah, if you could just scroll down to the recommended, it's near the end of his thing. Oh, anyway, it's essentially a common bag limit across all the recreational fishery sectors. Okay, good. I'm having trouble reading it.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And the next one is similar, although he phrases it as applying only to non-Alaska resident fishers who are fishing in the Alaska recreational fisheries. But in each case, we recommend that you refer the proponents to the North Pacific Council, because that's the proper arena for this sort of thing.
And just to telegraph ahead of time, I concur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So then I will note again for you the stakeholder statements as you've been looking through them. As I mentioned before, the majority have to do with the charter recreational fishery and IPHC regulatory area 3A. And indeed, I have, I think it was 16 additional statements that came in after the window closed to put them into the document. They also are about the IPHC regulatory area 3A charter recreational fishery. But I will note for you there are several other statements in there about different things, in particular about harvest rates and distribution. There's a couple of multi-page inputs there. There's one from Alpha, there's one from SEGO, there's one from Central Bering Sea Fishermen's Association, and those are all about allocations and harvest policy and how you might set TCEYs. I'm pointing them out to you now because the stakeholder statements are not all necessarily about particular regulatory proposals, but this is the one place that we gather for you all the stakeholder written statements that come in before your meeting, and so they're there for your consideration. And if you need any help navigating it, please let me know, but they're all there. Oh, Thank you, Mr. Ryall. This is information paper 1.
Mr. DeGreef.
Yeah, I tried to, just in future, would it be possible to organize these in some sort of fashion where similar requests were somehow ordered? Because I was having a lot of trouble. There's certainly a lot of statements. People have a lot of input. I want to consider most of it, or consider it all, but it would just be helpful if it was organized a little easier in future.
Yeah, through the chair, Mr. DeGreef, thank you for that comment. This is only the second time that we've done this paper, and what we've been doing so far is simply ordering them in the way they came in, the order they came in, but we can certainly order them by content and topic.
Can we build upon that as well, I guess, to provide a bit of a synopsis? If you group them into, here's the general theme and here's what these ones are saying. And then I guess what is the expectation from stakeholders when they write in these statements? Are they expecting to have an answer back? Or are they expecting to hear a reply at the meeting, which is basically then the answer? I think we need to make sure that we're not just receiving 47 statements and then considering them, but not having any comment about them. And so we need to answer them in some way, I guess is where I was going, but I'm not sure what the best way is at this point.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ryall, from our point of view, I would agree with that. I think it would be appropriate for the commission to acknowledge that you have this input from the stakeholders. And perhaps you do that across the floor in the public sessions, or in the big sessions. They don't require individual answers, but they are there for your consideration.
So I guess, is that clear to the people writing this in that they will be considered by the commissioners in making decisions going forward, but that there will not necessarily be answers to each one of these? I don't want to leave it hanging with people thinking that, oh, I sent in something and nothing ever happens. So what's the point of writing this?
Then we're going to respond to every single one versus.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I just, that would be a bit of a onerous task too. So I'm not suggesting that either, Chris, but maybe just communicating that, as Steve was saying, that we have considered each one of the statements have been provided to us, and that there will not be a written response to your answer, but they have been considered, and that would be the end of it.
I mean, I sort of assumed that was assumed and understood, but I welcome further comments from Steve or Dave.
Yeah, if I may, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ryall, we do actually answer them when they come in. We acknowledge that we have them and that we tell them that they will be in this paper and that they will be provided to you for your consideration. We haven't in the past done anything like after the annual meeting to say that you got them, but we can certainly do that as well. So we do acknowledge them as they come in and tell them what is going to be done with them.
Thanks, Chair. And I think the comment from Commissioner DeGreef would assist in that greatly. At the moment, as Steve has indicated, we just compile them in chronological order, and the vast majority of these are actually received in the last couple of days before the commission meeting. If we were to structure that information paper by agenda item, for example, it would be easy just to slot each one as we receive it into that relevant agenda item. And then the proposal could be then that when we have the public comment session on any particular agenda item from the floor or from the internet, from the webinar, we can then at that stage also raise to the attention that there are 5, 6, 7 public comments that were received as part of information paper 01. That way the commission acknowledges them publicly, and you could then combine those into any discussion on that particular agenda item. That might be a sensible way forward. I like that. Thanks, Chair.
Does that work?
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful. And I wasn't realizing as well that you had also provided feedback already just by saying you received them, and they will be put in the package and be considered. So I think that's good.
Great, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That is all I have right now on regulatory proposals and the process, subject to your questions. Again, we have time. We're meeting with the agencies this afternoon. We have time tomorrow in the agenda if you wish to discuss the proposals in any form or fashion. And we will ask you to start making decisions on regulatory proposals tomorrow afternoon so that we can kind of clear the decks of everything that can be cleared before Friday morning.
That sounds fine. Oh, Paul.
Just on timing for Friday, what time do you think we might be complete? I just bring it up because I think my flight's at 6 p.m. or something.
Through the chair, given the similar structure for a Friday morning, and we should be able to complete the session within an hour and a half or so. And then as per last year, it's up to the commission then how you'd like to adjourn before that report clearing session. And so I would expect that is there any wood, that we should be finished by mid-afternoon with the adoption of the report. Thanks, Chair.
Okay. So any further business for us today?
Yes, thanks, Chair. We do have the requested brief presentation on additional options for the Fishery Independent Setline Survey, and Dr. Ray Webster is going to come up and just present those additional options to you based on the requests from US and Canada. So,
You can come up, Ray, but I need to back up a second because there's an issue I wanted to raise that maybe is appropriate in the context of regulatory proposals or not. I'm not sure, but we've had a lot or some input. Recall the comments from the Commissioner of the Alaska Department of Fish and Game with regard to size limits. And this is an issue that the Commission, I recall, and several years ago when I was participating in a different capacity, looking at changing the minimum size limit, perhaps to get harvest more of those younger males, for example, or even potentially an upper size limit to protect some of the larger spawning females. And I've long been enamored with both of those potential options. And I know there are problems and issues with both of them, and they not necessarily be supported by everyone. And I don't know yet whether I would ultimately support that or not, but how do we get that? I know we're not going to do anything this week to change size limits. That's not my intent, but I would like to know how we get this back on the table for potential consideration at future meeting.
through the chair, the most direct response is that if a contracting party would like something on an agenda, we'll add it to the agenda, whether that be for the work meeting, interim meeting, or annual meeting. That said, if there is time, either today or tomorrow, we can certainly call upon Dr. Stewart to represent the last update on the size limit discussion in the paper he presented. I'm going to say it was in January of 2019. Just to get everybody up to speed and remind everybody of where we were, and then that may help carry discussions forward on how you'd like to proceed. So if there is time in the agenda, we could certainly ask Dr. Stewart to do that for you, and then moving forward, you could add it officially to an agenda.
And I don't know that we necessarily need Dr. Stewart to represent that, particularly if the consideration of time availability. But I would like to do whatever we need to do to actually be in a position to seriously consider that next year, or the next time we could potentially take formal action. Mr. Davis.
I guess my only thought about that is that this has been the subject of discussion a few times in recent years, and we may also, if we're going to revisit it, want to have the Secretariat's help in sort of synthesizing the outcomes of recent discussions about it, so that we can remind ourselves of what came forward, what were stakeholder perspectives on the options, and why haven't we gone down that path to date. just to kind of bring us up to speed with recent history around this.
Mr. DeGreef.
And added to that, rather than just recreate Dr. Stewart's past proposal or analysis, I think just the new sex ratio would be informative to that discussion as well. So I'd like to see a little bit more work done in terms of that as well.
Yeah, I think that's definitely related. And Mr. Yamato?
Yes, I believe the discussions all in the past, at least that I've heard, were all regarding a reducing the 32 inches to something lower, but I never heard too much about the upper restriction. Talk has been, maybe a size limit on the maximum retention for the commercial fleet. And I'd like to see the research done in that area. And maybe it's been done, but analyzing a slot where a lower slot limit and an upper slot limit, maybe, how that would affect the outcome on the fishery.
I'm recalling the previous work and discussion on lowering the lower size limit, but I don't know that there's been much examination of that question of creating a maximum size limit. So if there has, I'd appreciate that information, but I would like that to be part of the discussion too. Okay, I guess we can go to Dr. Webster if then.
Good morning. So I've been asked to prepare some additional slides to help inform discussion on the change in this design going forward. See if this works. So there seems
Sorry, through the chair. Just, is this available online at this point or?
no. So there seems to have been some discussion. I've just come from the conference board where there's certainly been discussion on this idea of reverting in some regulatory areas to the pre-2014 design, and specifically with respect to 2C, 3A, and 3B. This is what that pre-2014 design looks like. The orange stations are the stations that were targeted for fishing prior to the beginning of the expansion program, and the purple stations are those that are part of the full design now that were not fished prior to the expansion. So problem with this design, as was the case in all regulatory areas, is that these are not random spots that are being missed out. The former design in these three regulatory areas had no deep stations, and I know there's interest in getting information from those deeper waters. There were no deep stations. There was an undersampling of inshore stations, including no stations between 10 and 20 fathoms, but also including stations that were close to shore within the old depth range of 20 to 275 fathoms that just weren't part of the grid previously. And there are also some fairly large, in some cases, gaps in spatial coverage. In particular, the Shumagan Islands and Sanak Island in Western 3B had a large gap in coverage. Cook Inlet had relatively few stations in the vicinity of Cook Inlet, and there were gaps in coverage in and near Prince William Sound. So the concern with going back to, so we can do better than this design is what I'm going to advocate here. The concern with going back to a design like this is it would reintroduce the potential for bias due to these gaps in coverage being non-random. They're systematic gaps. They're associated with habitat in some way, or associated with geographical differences. And so this is what we hope to avoid by going forward with a design that's based on the full grid, subsampling the full grid in a random fashion. So there are no systematic gaps. We have complete coverage, even if it's at a subsample level. So if the underlying concern here in the proposal that we proposals that we put forward on Monday is that there's greater uncertainty because we're sampling at a lower rate, then there's a better way of dealing with that uncertainty. And the scientific approach to dealing with that uncertainty would be to increase the sampling rate. So still subsample, but subsample at a higher rate. So you're still getting coverage throughout the regulatory area without those systematic gaps that may introduce bias, but the uncertainty will be lower. So what might such a design look like? Well, this is so-called enhanced proposal for 2C, 3A, and 3B, which is the same fundamental design that we presented on Monday, except we have a higher sampling rate. The design on Monday had something in the order of 52 or 53% of stations from the full design subsampled. This one has now the same sample size, close to the same sample size as the pre-2014 design, but the stations have been selected as a randomized subsample. And you can see now there are no systematic gaps in coverage. The stations we don't sample are randomly scattered throughout. So we have a sampling of deep waters in proportional to their occurrence. We have stations in Shumagon and Sanak. We have stations in Cook Inlet and Prince William Sound, and we have stations in inshore waters that are sampled in proportion to their occurrence. So this would be a design that would produce unbiased estimates, and I think that's what the next slide says essentially. So that map shows a randomized design targeting the same stations. So if the same station numbers that we had previously, but without systematic gaps in coverage, the entire depth range is sampled, no missing pieces, and it will produce unbiased estimates, which is not necessarily the case with reverting back to the pre-2014 design itself. And so note that nevertheless, our evaluation showed that we don't need to have such high sampling rates to achieve our scientific objectives. And indeed, with low uncertainty in the original proposal, we'd expect similar weight PNF and numbers PNF and indices compared to this enhanced proposal. And I try to think of a way of illustrating that. And what I came up with was looking at 3A and 3B in 2019, where we have the full design sampled. What would we have got if we had used one of these subsampling proposals? And how does that compare? And my contention was that because we're still sampling at a high rate and precision is very good, that we would expect something similar, and that is exactly what we do get. So here, looking at the mean adjusted 032 weight per unit effort, and these are raw values, not model output. The model output, in fact, might be closer in these scenarios, of 112 pounds per skate and 78 pounds per skate for 3A and 3B respectively, based on the design that was the randomized design, subsample design that was presented on Monday. Now, the enhanced proposal with the higher sampling rate produces very similar values, 111 and 79 pounds per skate. The full design that we actually undertook in 2019 have values of 114 and 80 pounds per skate. There's no meaningful difference between any of these three numbers for either of those areas in terms of the effect it would have on the stock assessment or stock distribution and the decisions, management decisions that was result from that. So the rationale for this is not for going to a higher sampling rate would not be a scientific rationale. We don't scientifically need these extra stations to get the quality of data that we need. So it would be logistical or policy considerations would be the considerations that would come into play in making that decision. So I'm happy to take questions on these ideas.
Mr. Davis.
Well, I will attempt to capture what I think we're trying to achieve here, but other commissioners can weigh in. My sense is that, at least on the Canadian delegation side, there are a number of questions about the idea of shifting from what we used to do to what the Secretary is proposing to do. And so I think what at least we as Canadian commissioners have been talking about is how do we set up a process that will help to manage that transition from an old way to a new way and bring others along with us and ensure that there's understanding and that we maintain a very high level of buy-in to the information that's generated from the survey, because it's such a critical input to everything we do here. And so with that in mind, and hearing about, you know, questions around things like the logistics of fishing in a new way, the implications of for the science of the new survey design versus the old one, we had been contemplating this idea of trying to find something, like trying to buy ourselves a bit of time, essentially, to make space for that conversation before landing on a longer term plan for moving forward. Hence this idea that is circulating in a few different places about the pre-2014 design. So that's my sense of the intent here. I guess, so I don't know if that sheds any additional light for you on this, Dr. Webster, but when I look to this, I guess I'm not quite certain yet about how different would that end up being. I mean, I get a visual sense, but is there anything more we can say about that? And then the other question that will certainly come up for us is what's the scoop with 2B?
So we had some discussion in the conference board about 2B as well. So I quickly did work up a couple of figures that are not part of this presentation. So a similar enhanced design for 2B. So 2B had previously 170 stations targeted, not excluding stations that were now prohibited from fishing. So an enhanced design then would, instead of distributing those according to the old pre-2014 design, would distribute those throughout the part of 2B that we're proposing sampling. So it would essentially be a higher sampling rate than what we proposed on Monday, but it would still be full spatial coverage. So 2B is even more problematic than this. The gaps in coverage are more substantial. Even considering that we're not proposing sampling Strait of Georgia, Salish Sea again in 2020 because of near zero catch rates, there are substantial gaps in the inside waters to the north. And some of those waters had very good catch rates in 2018. There would be no sampling of Dogfish Bank in the shallow waters. And again, those catch rates, while lower than average, were higher than we had previously been predicting based on last time we surveyed them in the 90s. And there were also some very high catch rates in south of Haida Gwaii and elsewhere. So in 1 year, we're not going to, because of the space-time model, in 1 year, we're not going to introduce a lot of bias. In fact, this would be the second year for 2B by keeping the old design, but it's still not desirable. We can do better by taking that effort. If the concern is that we're not putting enough effort here, there's greater uncertainty, maybe we're going to get something weird that's not like what we would get if we fish the sole design that we're more comfortable with. The better way of managing that is to take the effort that you would have put in to that old design, the 170 stations, but distribute them in a more scientific way, that you cover all of the habitat in order to produce an unbiased estimate for that regulatory area. Because as time goes on, if we keep with this 2014 design, pre-2014 design, that bias is going to creep back into the estimates as we become further in time from the time we actually collected observations. And that's something we, scientifically, that's very undesirable. So yeah, I can present illustrations of what this would look like for 2B as well.
Okay, and maybe you can walk me through this again as far as the number of stations. So pre-2014, I understand that we're not covering all the areas, and so you have this this advanced design. I don't know what you call it, but what do you use?
Enhanced.
Enhanced proposal, which would cover these areas, but the target being almost the same amount of stations that we use before we did the expanded stations. But you're saying that when you do that, you're oversampling. Use the word, we're oversampling, and it's not necessary. So are you saying that we can further reduce the stations than we had in 2014? Or what does that mean when you say we're oversampling now using this new enhanced model?
So I'm not sure I used the word over, I hope I didn't use the word oversampling, but we are collecting, from a scientific point of view, more data is great. We always like more data, but there's a cost to collecting this data, and we don't need scientifically all of the stations in this enhanced design. There may be logistical reasons for wanting to collect additional stations. It might make the management of the charter vessels and bidding process smoother, for example. It may enhance stakeholder buy-in to see that we have still a high sampling rate. I think that may be one of the bigger concerns, and that we have a high sampling rate, and so that they feel more reassured that we're doing a good job and we're going to get something close to what we would have got had we sampled the full design. But scientifically, we don't need all of this information.
So Ray, I want to thank you for putting this together. This makes me feel a lot better, this option going forward for the next 2 years. I want to thank the staff and David for looking in on this. I'm reluctant to support the previous one with the more space that we were looking at. Going into these difficult years where we may be having to further reduce these quotas the next 2 years. And I'd like to know what I don't want this to be considered a weak spot in our, and a criticism from the public and the industry if we do have to further reduce harvests over the next couple of years. So I'm good with this one.
Peter had a question, and then Paul.
Yeah, my question's just around for sablefish in Canada. They went from a fixed survey design to a randomized survey design, and they actually had to overlay for a number of years before that transition. I'm just curious why that isn't being proposed here as well, or if that's not necessary, or just, I don't have a scientific background, so I'm not sure why they did that and it's not being proposed here.
Thank you. I totally appreciate that question, Commissioner DeGreef. One point of clarification is that there are perhaps different interpretations of what we mean by randomized design in this context and what is perhaps more commonly considered a randomized design. And I'm not familiar with the sablefish example, but an example more familiar to me is the NMFS Troll Survey in the Gulf of Alaska, where they re-randomize the stations every year. The locations, every 2 years. However often they do it. The locations are new locations each time. They don't go back to the same stations, but it's a perfectly valid design. Ours is something, what we're proposing is something in between. We have a fixed station design. We're maintaining this fixed grid. We're not getting rid of the fixed grid at all. We are revisiting the same stations that we fished before, but our proposal is that we revisit a subsample of those. So I don't think we have the same concerns with, say, what you might be discussing with the sablefish design, or if we transition to a completely randomized design. Those designs have more inherent variability in estimating trends, because you're not going back to the same stations every year. There's extra variability coming into your estimates because of differences in what the underlying density is at different locations. There's not just temporal variability because the distribution has changed, density has gone up or down over an area, you've gone to different locations and there's going to be some noise in the data because of that. The appealing thing about our fixed grid design, which stays a fixed grid design even if in a subsampling proposal, is that we revisit the same stations each year, and it gives us a more precise look at what the trends are. You can be more confident that the change from one year to the next is not just due to some random fluke because we happen to visit an entirely different set of stations. It's because there was some underlying change in density. So I think there are two, what we're doing and likely what they did in the sablefish design and what they're doing in the NIMS Gulf of Alaska are different things. And so I don't feel that, essentially we do have the overlay. This is the overlay, I guess. We are fishing the same fixed grid, but it's a subsample of that grid. So we have the past to look at for consistency.
Thank you.
Paul. Yeah, thanks very much. I guess maybe I'd start off by saying what Neil introduced is the overarching, I guess, concern, Ray, about and why there's some questions about how to move forward. And so then I was trying to think of an analogy, and this one's certainly not perfect, but I know how my all-season tires perform going down the road because I've had them on the car for a long time, and I know when I'm going to get it into trouble and know I should stop driving. And so then if we put on these new improved snow tires, and yeah, it's definitely going to be better, but we actually don't know the comparison very well between the old ones and the new ones. And so we do know from pre-2014 that what the survey did, and we are aware of the issues and why we went into the expansion over the 6 years. But I guess one of the concerns that's come up, and so is that if the survey goes down because we've introduced something new, is that because it's new, or is it because that's what the stock is doing? On the flip side, if it goes up, I'm sure people will be a lot happier, but then it'll be the same question, is that really there or not in comparison to the old one? So those are all the kind of the questions that are going through people's minds. And then thinking about how to move forward. And so the proposal was to was to look at the core areas defined as 2B through 3B. And carry on with the pre-2014 survey and maybe make some adjustments on the margins of to the south and to the west. So, and then I guess the question I have is, if we did the pre-2014, we still have data from all the expansion survey stations, and is the question not how often do we go back and resample those stations, or is it a totally different question? I'm thinking about this wrong, because if we did the pre-2014 survey design, we still have data from all those expansion stations collected over the years, and would that still not be included in the analysis if that model was put in place?
Commissioner Ryall, yes, it would. The data is still there, and that's why when we did whenever we do an expansion, we see an improvement to the entire time series, not just the year in which we do the expansion. Going forward, if we persist with going back with a pre-2014 design, and it's an impossible one to justify scientifically, but I understand the appeal of something familiar. But if we continue doing that, bias will start to creep back in as the data that we collected in those areas falls back into the past. And so you can get a sense of this by looking at areas like the time series for 2A, where you see it, where we fished California in 2014 and 2017. But if you look back in the time series for 2A, the uncertainty and potential bias in those southern areas creeps in, and you get this ballooning out, and the time series starts to drift off to numbers that may not be realistic for what was actually observed back then, because we just don't know what it looked like in California in 2005 or something. So the same thing is going to creep in if we persist with this old design. So while I appreciate this is a transition and maybe reluctant to rip the Band-Aid off in 1 year, there are substantial advantages to a design which samples proportionally throughout the habitat to one that has known biases built into the design.
Neil, so I'm just thinking about where to from here. We don't have all the expertise, I don't think, to land on direction on this without some input from others. So I'm wondering if, Dr. Webster, you mentioned you discussed this with the advisory bodies, but was something presented to them?
So no, the designs in 2A, 4A, and 4B, the sub-area designs were presented to the SRB twice and met with their support. This randomized design is something we thought of during the interim meeting, as you might recall, when there was concern about the sub-area, expanding the sub-area design that was presented to the SRB to these core areas. So we came up with it as an alternative to that, so that we had complete spatial coverage throughout these core areas, even if it was at a lower sampling rate. And at a sampling rate, that still met our scientific needs. So the SRB itself has not had a chance to weigh in on the randomized design. I can't speak for them, but my feeling is that that's a more appealing design scientifically than the sub-area design for a number of reasons, and particularly in these core areas, there's no chance of missing any distributional changes in the stock over a modest scale. We will have collect age data throughout instead of missing chunks where the age distribution might be different, and environmental data collected consistently. And one of our scientific review board members did point to this kind of design, not this kind of design, no one wanted that, point to this kind of design as something that could be considered, but while recognizing that there are logistical issues with a sparser design in terms of getting numbers of stations, running time, and that so on in a day. So, but the short answer is the SRB has not seen the randomized design.
Yeah, Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. Another aspect I'm hearing a lot of input from is timing. Timing, in particular, one that you had mentioned, an expansion survey of Dogfish Bank, and the timing was when there's lots of dogfish there. So I was just wondering, and there are times when there is not as much dogfish there, and that's kind of a common knowledge. I'm just curious how you incorporate timing, if you do at all. And I know that's more general and not specific to this, but I think it's an important part of the discussion just from the feedback I'm getting.
Thank you. In general, the timing of the survey, we have a window in which we consider the survey stations to be effective, and that's the end of May to the mid-September, September 15th. And any variation in distribution within that window is essentially considered random variation that, for the purposes of estimation. So, and it would average out hopefully in the course of a year, but certainly over time. With specifically related to the timing of bycatch species, of other species on the survey, we make adjustment for that catch. If we're getting high catch rates of dogfish on Dogfish Bank, then that's incorporated in the estimates of weight per unit effort, numbers per unit effort. We have a hook competition adjustment or standardization that accounts for that. So where there is high competition, essentially when we get few baits back because they've been taken by other species or by other halibut themselves, then the weight per unit efforts for those stations will be adjusted upwards depending on the degree of competition. If there's another year where the competition is lower than average, then the weight per unit effort, so therefore we're catching more halibut because there was less competition, the weight per unit effort, numbers per unit effort will be adjusted downwards. So that specific instance is something we do a good job of accounting for, that kind of variation in competitors for the baits.
Thanks.
All right, Mr. Ryall.
Thanks, Chris. Dr. Webster, how many stations does this proposal include? Yeah, and what would it compare to far as pre-2014?
This proposal is the same number of stations as pre-2014 for 2C to 3B. It's designed to be that. It's designed to, so in that case, in 2C, it's 110, 3A is 374, and 3B, I think it's 232.
All right, so the same number of stations, but distributed in a random fashion around the area, but staying within the parameter of the same number of stations.
Correct.
And the view that you've been expressing is that this is a better way to go than pre-2014.
Correct.
Yeah. So thanks very much for making this proposal and bringing it to our attention and trying to address the question that we posed yesterday. So maybe just a way forward, I wonder, I guess, do we want to have this presented to Conference Board and PAG? Because a lot of the questions have been coming, at least on the Canadian side, from members in both of those, and would it be helpful for them to hear the presentation from Dr. Webster directly? Or the alternative is to, we communicate Dr. Webster's to our respective delegations, but it won't allow any questions if we do the latter. And so I guess I'm proposing, I'd like to see it presented to both boards so they can have an opportunity to provide some feedback.
Dr. Webster.
If I may, we have already presented it to the Conference Board and they have discussed it and considered it as when they were making their motions this morning.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch, what was the resolution?
Oh, the resolution? I can't speak to that exactly.
I was referring to, you presented this to the Conference Board?
We did present this to the Conference Board and became part of their discussion this morning.
But they have not made a.
They've made a motion regarding 3A specifically, but I don't have the details exactly.
All right, and so that covers off 50%. Do we want to do 2PAG? I'm going to pose the question to them if they want to hear it.
They would need the information today to make comments because I think they give their presentations tomorrow, so.
Yep.
I certainly don't object to that. Guess we could have someone ask the PAG or suggest the PAG, ask the PAG if they want it, and if presumably Dr. Webster is available to do that.
And sorry, through the chair, just to get confirmation, is that an indication that the Commission is leaning towards this enhanced proposal versus the 2014? I think that would also help if Ray's presenting to give an indication of that the Commission is considering this as the alternative to the thinner design that was previously proposed. Or do you want to just leave it open-ended? Thanks, Chair.
I'll let Paul go first.
Well, we haven't seen 2B, so I guess maybe just a clarification of what you were proposing there, Dr. Webster.
Okay.
If I may, through the chair, 2B, the understanding was that the design that was presented on day 2, is what's being carried forward with the understanding that Canada wanted additional stations on the outside of Vancouver Island. And if those were indicated, that we would just add those as additional stations, noting that they're high revenue stations. And so in the sense, it wouldn't impact the bottom line with the FIS. Don't necessarily need the data, but we could certainly include those. So maybe that's a case of Ray taking the map for 2B that was presented and sitting with the Canadian delegation, and you just indicating which of the additional stations that you're requesting, and then we could put that up as a slide. Thanks, Chair.
Neil?
Well, just in terms of how to characterize this, I think it was Dr. Wilson's question. So I would characterize it as the commission asked for a revised design that addressed some of the issues we had raised. This is what Dr. Webster has put together, and we want to hear from the conference board and PAG about their views, support for this. I don't think we're yet at the point where, like, I'm not going to support this until I hear from what the delegation has to say about it. And then I think we're better positioned to say yes or no or make these adjustments.
Okay, so are we all in agreement on how this will proceed? I think we are. All right, thank you. Okay, so we have a free afternoon, and I know some of us will be busy with various meetings. And so I guess we will be in recess until tomorrow morning.